The last thing I want to do in this lecture is talk about a further application, a further problem that sense and reference might be used to solve. And it's not 100% clear if Frege was aware of this, but there are definitely various places in the paper that we read where I think it seems to me that Frege seems to be aware of it, although he doesn't talk about this directly. But I think it's going to be helpful for you and also helpful for our discussion in weeks to come to see how sense and reference might be used to solve a further problem for the million view of names, which is the problem of what are called empty names. So remember, for the last time, the million view of names is that the meaning of a name is just what it stands for. So the meaning of the name David Boylan is just me, the person. That's what the meaning of it is. However, obviously there are names which seem to be names for things that don't exist. For instance, think about, well, actually an example we've been using, Superman, or another example, Santa Claus. These are both names for things that don't exist. Sorry to anyone if that's breaking bad news to anybody. There just is no person that Superman really is the name of. He's a fictional character. There just is no person that the name Santa Claus is the name of. But then this raises the question that, well, if these names are not actually names of anything, doesn't that mean on the million view that they're meaningless? So remember the million picture of meaning for names. We have a name like Santa Claus. The meaning of the name is just like the person it stands for. There's a rather terrible picture of Santa Claus. Looks more like Gandalf. So you might have thought, well, the meaning of the name Santa Claus just is Santa Claus, but Santa Claus doesn't exist. Really, there's nothing here. But if the meaning of a name is just what it stands for, and Santa Claus stands for something that doesn't exist, doesn't that mean that the name Santa Claus is just meaningless? It has no meaning. It doesn't stand for anything. You might have thought it stood for something, and sometimes we might talk as if it stands for something, but actually stands for nothing. Exactly the same thing would hold for Superman. There is no such guy as Superman, so isn't the name Superman meaningless for the same reason? And that seems like a pretty bad conclusion. It seems like that even if Superman doesn't exist and the name Santa Claus doesn't exist, these words really mean something. We use them to say things all the time. How could they be meaningless? Let me give you a quick argument using the compositionality principle that they really must mean different things. So I have these two examples on the handout. So one sentence says, if Santa Claus existed, he would go around the world delivering presents on Christmas Eve. Another sentence says, if Superman existed, he would go around the world delivering presents on Christmas Eve. These sentences seem like they say something very different. And we can see that because one of them seems obviously true, and the other one seems false. It seems obviously true that if Santa Claus existed, he would go around the world delivering presents. And it doesn't seem true that if Superman existed, he would go around the world delivering presents on Christmas Eve. He would be fighting aliens or something like that, whatever it is that Superman does. So these sentences say different things. We can see that because one of them looks true and the other one looks false. But remember, just like before, the only difference between the sentences is where one of them says Santa Claus, the other one says Superman. So if there's a difference between what they mean, then the compositionality principle says, well, it must be because Superman means something different from Santa Claus. But how could that be if they're just meaningless? The million theory says that, well, since they don't stand for anything, since the objects they stand for don't exist, the names just mean nothing at all. So it's hard to make sense of how these sentences would say different things if the only difference between them is that where one has one meaningless name where the other one has a different meaningless name. It's not clear why these would mean different things on the million view, given that neither object exists, and so both sentences include this name that doesn't stand for anything. So that's another reason to think that it actually really isn't meaningless. These names they just can't be meaningless. We seem to say things with them all the time, and in particular, we say different things. We say different things with the name Superman as we do with the name Santa Claus, even though neither of those people exist. So we have another problem for the million theory of names. And in fact, this is also another problem that maybe Frege's theory helps us with. Because something that Frege seems to do is he leaves open the idea that maybe an expression can have sense and no reference. So he does think that whenever an object has a referent, it must also have a sense. But sometimes he thinks that sometimes the sense just delivers nothing. Sometimes it's a recipe that never actually gives you a particular output. So he gives one example of this in the paper. He talks about the expression, the celestial body most distant from the earth. Now this isn't a name in our sense, it's really a description, but it still makes the same point. So he thinks this is something that clearly has a sense, because it seems to have a meaning attached to it. It seems to give us a way of thinking about a particular object. But in fact, it's unlikely that there really is any such thing as the celestial body most distant from the Earth. Probably the universe is infinite for anything you could find. There's always some object that's further away. So there just is no such thing as the celestial body most distant from the Earth. But that doesn't at all, Frege thinks, tell us that the expression is senseless. Rather, this is an example of something that has a sense and has no referent. And this, I think, is exactly what he would want to say about our other examples too. Superman and Santa Claus are both examples of names that have sense and no reference. And here the picture is something like this. So we have a name like Santa Claus. There is a mode of presentation or a way of thinking about an object associated with Santa Claus, like maybe like guy with a hat, delivers presents, has magic reindeer. So something like this is the sense, that's the sort of way of thinking about the object. And remember, we said the sense is sort of like a recipe for determining what the referent is. Well, as a matter of fact, there is nobody in the world with all these properties. And so that's why, well, there just is no referent in this case. So in cases where the sense just doesn't actually pick out somebody in the actual world, Frege is thinking the name is going to have sense without reference. And clearly, we can see as well that different names that lack reference will still have different meanings. So compare Superman. What's the sense of Superman going to be? Well, that's going to be something like, as we said before, a guy with a cape and superpowers. Now I'm using the X to say that just like in the case of Santa Claus, this name doesn't actually refer to anything. But it's pretty clear that even though both names don't refer to anything, they have different senses. The name Superman, the sense associated with that is something like guy with a cape who has superpowers. Now, just like in the case of Santa Claus, that's a recipe for finding something that never actually delivers something, because there is in fact no guy with a cape and superpowers. But just because the two recipes are unsuccessful doesn't mean that they're the same recipe. These are still different ways of trying to think about an object, even if neither of them actually succeeds in thinking about a particular object in the real world. So this is a potential further advantage of thinking there's sense as well as reference. If all there is to the meaning of the name is what it stands for, then it's hard to explain the fact that these don't seem to mean the same thing. The word or the expression Santa Claus doesn't seem to mean the same thing as the word Superman. And if we have sense, we can say, it does seem like maybe we can say that some objects have sense without reference. And if we're allowed to say that, then we can perfectly well explain why these things mean different things. Clearly, whatever the sense for Santa Claus is, it would be very different from what the sense for Superman is. Now, I will highlight that it's not completely obvious that it really does make sense to think of the sense of a name which doesn't actually name anything, where the object doesn't exist. Because let's take a step back and think about how we explained to ourselves what a sense is. We did this in two ways. First of all, we talked about this idea that maybe senses are ways of thinking about objects, or they're modes of presentations for objects. And then we also had this analogy with the telescope. So we said that the sense of a name, that's sort of like the image in the telescope that is presented to each of the people, and not like the idea in their heads, which that image causes. And on either of these ways of thinking about sense or trying to understand sense, it's not really clear, it's not 100% obvious that it really makes sense to think of a sense without a referent. Because you might think, well, for something, take first the mode of presentation idea. For something to be presented in a particular way, well, it has to be presented. The object has to be presented. But in cases of non-existence, well, there just is no object. So how could we have a mode of presentation for an object that doesn't exist? Or how does it make sense to have a way of thinking about something that doesn't exist? Likewise, the same kind of problem arises in the telescope analogy. Because again, the image in the telescope example is caused by a real object. It's hard to see how there could be an image in a telescope of the moon if there just was no moon. So that analogy either doesn't really help us understand how there could be senses without objects for them to present or for them to be like images of. So it's somewhat controversial whether this distinction of sense and reference also helps us with the empty names problem. I did want to talk about it today because, for one thing, it is yet another important problem with the million view that we're going to talk about more in weeks to come. But also when we start talking about Russell next week, Russell is going to have his own way of thinking about something which is not exactly the same, but quite similar to Frege's notion of sense. And it is going to give us a way of thinking about what the sense of a non-existent object might be. So the takeaway here is, first of all, there is this problem for the million view of names. What do you say about names that refer to things that don't exist? We see that if you can have sense without reference, then Frege has an easy explanation of this. However, our final thought before we go is that given how the notion of sense was introduced to us, given what Frege said about sense, it's not 100% obvious he's really entitled to this thing which he claims. So he claims you can have sense without reference. Our question is, well, does that really make sense given what he told us about what sense is?